Hey there, self-care warriors. Welcome back to Self-Care Haven. Today I wanted to talk to you about the differences between a victim of abuse who reacts maladaptively to the abuse versus an abuser. So, what distinguishes us from our abusers? Well, the first is our ability to take accountability for our actions. So, if you've been the victim of chronic abuse, eventually you will react in a way that is probably out of character, out of in line with your values, and you may even engage in a behavior that you consider abusive. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't take accountability for that. I mean, we can still say, yes, the way I behaved was not in line with my values, but there is a difference between that reaction versus the abuser inflicting cruelty and name-calling and psychological warfare and mind games onto you, because you are able to take accountability for your actions. They often aren't. If they ever apologize or show remorse, it's often because they want to keep you hooked. It's not because they really want to change. Whereas the victim of abuse has suffered so much at the hands of his or her abuser, honestly, their reactions are, I use the word maladaptive because they are not the best coping mechanisms, but they are understandable reactions to this type of abuse. If you are defending yourself, for example, that's not you being the abuser. That's self-defense. So if you're defending yourself against physical violence, if you're defending yourself against an emotional attack, I don't consider that to be you being the abuser. Although I'm sure there's a lot of victims out there who will think differently and think, well, I was being the abuser, I was becoming the abuser. If you take accountability for your actions and you know that you are not trying to inflict pain on somebody out of cruelty, and you know that they have been abusing you, that is not being the abuser. That is reacting maladaptively to the abuse. When I say maladaptively, I mean that there are better ways to handle it, of course, but when you're in a toxic situation like that, I mean, there's just so many psychological reasons why victims react the way that they do. And they've been silenced for so long that it's no wonder that when they reach their breaking point, they let out all that anger and that anxiety and that grief, and they're the ones who are made to look crazy by their abuser and by society. And so we have to think about the fact that an abuse victim who has been abused, especially for a long period of time, or has been made to feel crazy, has been made to walk on eggshells, and finally reacts or finally snaps, is not necessarily the abuser. There's so many complex dynamics involved. And so I don't believe in this idea of mutual abuse, because yes, you can have a mutually abusive relationship, it's possible, but what's often happening at the root is an imbalance of power. From the very beginning, there has been some abuser, there has been one abuser in the relationship, and the other person starts reacting maladaptively to that abuser, trying to cope with that situation in whatever way they can. And of course, the best coping mechanism would be to detach and leave the relationship, gain resources and support, but every situation is complex, it's different, there's a lot of trauma bonding to get through, and the survivor may still be in the relationship for whatever reason. And what happens is that society thinks it's okay to label that relationship mutually abusive, because that way both of them are abusing each other, so it's nobody's fault. It's nobody's problem. Wrong. It is the abuser's problem. Because had the abuser never abused that person in the first place, had never put them through that trauma, this victim would not be reacting in a way that was against their values or standards. Now, I'm not taking away accountability or agency from that victim. However, you have to understand that when you subject someone to so much stress and trauma, they are going to react in ways that will seem crazy to the public, but are in fact the reactions of a trauma-bonded individual, someone who has been traumatized. They will show anger. They will show the ability to defend themselves. They will even try to cut down the abuser. I mean, this is the reality of what it's like to be in an abusive relationship. And in order for mutual abuse to even exist, I'm going to put down the link to the domestic hotlines blogs, National Domestic Hotlines blog. They have an excellent article, and they have a lot of excellent articles, by the way. Recently, I was actually featured on there, so if you haven't read my article on the National Domestic Violence Hotline, please do. I'll leave a link to that as well below. It's called 5 Powerful Self-Care Tips for Abuse and Trauma Survivors, so I hope you guys enjoy that. But yeah, they have a lot of amazing articles about the very things that narcissistic abuse survivors often wonder about, and one of them is there such a thing as mutual abuse? Abuse that is being co-created, that is going both ways. Now, theoretically, of course, that kind of relationship can in fact exist, and I'm sure it does in real life. But when it comes to narcissistic abuse, it is such a complex topic. It's so complex because it is very hard to identify who is the abuser and who is the abused if you're just an outsider who doesn't know anything about the relationship or the dynamics involved. For example, let's say you have a narcissistic parent, and this person has bullied you, has raised you in a way, and treated you in a way that has traumatized you. Let's say you guys are out in public. They make a comment that seems seemingly innocuous to the public, or may be very small, something that other people would not react to because they haven't been through the abuse. Let's say your narcissistic parent has always put you down for not accomplishing something, and they bring that up in a very kind of snide manner in public, and then the victim, because they've been through that dynamic so many times before, and you guys know this because as survivors, when you go through abuse, you don't go through it. Obviously, it's not a one-time incident. It's something that happens over and over and over and over again. So this is the type of, especially if you've been raised by a narcissistic parent, this is the type of chronic abuse that happens and happens for such a long time that you become conditioned and you become on the defense. You're in fight and flight or flight mode or fawn freeze mode, and you react in a way that is considered by society as like, oh my god, are they the abuser? And that's when it gets really complicated, because then society thinks that you are the crazy one because you're like, stop it, and you get overreactive and you get sensitive to that comment, and anybody else who's looking from the outside will see this crazy person who's so highly sensitive, and you've been told that your whole life probably if you've been the victim of narcissistic abuse since childhood, or you were in a marriage with a narcissistic abuser. So that's how easy it is for narcissists to gaslight the public into believing that their victims are the crazy ones, their victims are the pathological ones. But believe you me, if any person who's looking from the outside was placed in that same situation, they would react in a maladaptive manner, in a way that does not align with their values or their best needs, because of course their best need is to detach as soon as possible and try to get away from the relationship as soon as possible. But again, with the complex dynamics at play, you may still have contact with a narcissistic abuser for whatever reason. Maybe you have a narcissistic family member. Maybe you have a spouse who you share custody with, an ex-spouse who you share custody with. There's so many different dynamics at play. And so let's try to dismantle this idea that there's such a thing as mutual abuse. I mean, there can be, but more often than not, it's very likely that there is that main abuser who is provoking the victim and silencing the victim, shaming the victim, and subjecting that victim to chronic abuse to the point where they have a breaking point, to the point where they engage in maladaptive coping methods. They may, if they're defending themselves, that's self-defense. If they're defending themselves against physical violence or even an emotional attack, and they're going no contact with that person. Remember, no contact is different from stonewalling. I've heard this question many times before. especially when I do coaching with clients and they wonder, like, is no contact stonewalling? Am I stonewalling the narcissist? No, you're not stonewalling the narcissist. You're engaging in self-care. There's a difference between stonewalling and no contact. There's a difference between walking away from an abuser and stonewalling someone deliberately to shut down their viewpoint and treating them as if their perspectives are worthless. There's this very, very big distinction between the two, because when you're stonewalling someone, you have the intent to preserve power in that dynamic. You have the intent to preserve control in that dynamic. When you're going no contact with an abuser, you're engaging in self-care. You're saying, I'm not having this anymore. I'm standing up for myself. I'm defending myself. And I'm protecting myself. And I need to get out of this dynamic once and for all. And I'm not going to, especially if, let's say, you live with your narcissistic abuser, maybe it's a spouse or a family member. If you decide that you're not going to be subject to their abuse anymore and you walk away from them when they're trying to abuse you or trying to belittle you or demean you, that is self-care. That is not stonewalling. It's very different. So it's a very complex topic. I'm sure you guys have a lot of thoughts on this, and I know it's a lot more nuanced than one way or the other. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think that there is such a thing as mutual abuse? Have you engaged in actions that you would consider abusive towards your abuser? Or do you believe that your reactions were, in fact, legitimate reactions to abuse? I want to hear your thoughts on this topic. It is very complex, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of insights from your own personal experiences, so I'm excited to hear that. If you haven't pre-ordered my book yet, it's called Becoming the Narcissist Nightmare, How to Devalue and Discard the Narcissist While Supplying Yourself. And I've gotten a lot of questions regarding whether there's going to be a print version. Yes, there's going to be a print version shortly after the ebook release. But the pre-order for the ebook is available right now, so you can reserve a copy right now. So I'll leave that link in the description below, along with the others, to that amazing article about mutual abuse, as well as my article on the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And I hope you guys read it and enjoy it, and I hope that these videos are helping, and I hope they're empowering to you. Leave me your insights, your perspectives on this topic below. I know it's very controversial, I know it's very complex, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So I'll talk to you very soon. Until then, take care. Hey guys, I just wanted to put in a disclaimer. This video is not meant to be a justification for abuse. It's more so a discussion about the complex dynamics between the victim and the abuser. Often society labels abusive relationships with the question of, well, it takes two to tango. And no, it doesn't take two to tango. It often takes just one pathological individual in the relationship to provoke the other person to participate in this complex dynamic of abuse. And of course, the victim still has agency. They're still accountable for their actions. However, I do think that a victim's reactions, normal reactions to abuse, are often mislabeled as abuse, or if they're defending themselves, it's often labeled as abuse. And that is completely different from a victim of abuse really going on the path to retaliation and completely destroying the abuser's life, which would be considered abuse. That's different. Legitimate emotional reactions and self-defense are not abuse. And if you are engaging in maladaptive coping mechanisms in any way, remember that you have been subjected to trauma, you have been subjected to abuse, and of course the best coping mechanism would be to detach from the abuser, engage in self-care, and try to leave that relationship as soon as possible. Try to minimize as much contact as you possibly can. Each circumstance, each situation is different, I know, and you will have to adjust and adapt based on your specific circumstances. But just make sure that you are engaging in healthy coping mechanisms, because even though your reactions are most likely legitimate and justifiable in the context and understandable, perfectly understandable, yes, we don't want to turn into abusers. We definitely don't. And so, of course, we can still take accountability. We can still have some agency and power. But that doesn't mean that we should mislabel our reactions or emotional reactions to abuse as a form of mutual abuse, because if the predator, if the perpetrator had never even instigated such a dynamic, it's very unlikely that we would have reacted in that way. So I hope this helps put some perspective onto this video so that it doesn't get perceived as some sort of justification for abuse. It's not meant to be that at all. It's more meant to be about the mislabeling and stereotyping of abuse survivors and how this myth of mutual abuse gets thrown around a lot to justify abuse and to justify allowing the abuser to escape accountability for his or her actions. So I hope this makes sense. I hope that you guys can contribute to this discourse. It's a very complex, controversial topic, and I look forward to hearing your insights. So until then, take care.